In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Ghostblade build, which is an all-game build that focuses on the use of the Death's Poker greatsword. A lot of people have been asking me to make a build for this weapon for a very long time, and I finally got around to doing it. We are back to some Elden Ring content leading up to hopefully what is the expansion launch sometime soon next year, so I hope you guys enjoy. So first of all, let's take a look at the Death's Poker weapon. This is a greatsword. It is rather light for a greatsword, weighing 8.5. It has native frostbite buildup on it, which is fantastic. The damage of this weapon is not that good for a greatsword. However, its weapon skill, Ghost Flame Ignition, is exceptional, and I want to talk a bit about that. So Ghost Flame Ignition is a weapon art where you sort of stick your poker forward and do like a ghost flame effect that deals magic damage repeatedly if you hit the target with it, which is kind of like a thrust. And then you can follow up with either an R2 and an R1. The R1 sets a fire trail or a ghost flame trail out in front of you that does damage as enemies are standing in it and builds up frostbite. And the R2 sort of slams the weapon down, that does an explosion, that does magic damage, and also does frostbite buildup. Now what's really interesting is that this weapon skill does 100% magic damage, but the weapon itself does mostly physical damage with poor magic damage scaling. And you can increase intelligence to further boost the damage of this weapon skill, but it won't add a lot of damage to the melee attacks of this weapon in general. So I prioritize dexterity and strength since they emphasize the damage of the melee attacks of the weapon itself, which is rather low to begin with. So if you don't crank these, you're going to be doing very low melee damage with your regular attacks. You're not going to be using the weapon skill on every single enemy you face. And the weapon skill itself does tons and tons of damage. So I don't feel like you really need to boost intelligence in order to play this weapon, and I think it's probably better to lean into dexterity and strength in order to have a decent melee attack as well as a good weapon skill. Now, of the R1 and R2 attacks, I feel like the R1 is much more potent in terms that like you can lead a boss into it or a difficult enemy by using it prematurely in order to like set up a ground fire effect and then let the enemy walk into it and fight them inside that, triggering frostbite, which usually interrupts them, which allows you to like R1 them or R2 them, or even use another L2 and R2, or just, you know, another L2 and R1. And you can set this up very, very well on bosses that tend to walk towards you, which is most of them. So it works fantastic in that scenario, and I feel like the damage that it does compared to the R2 is just more in general. And sometimes some bosses jump backwards, and you'll notice them jump out of the R2 when you use it, and sometimes you'll miss, whereas with the R1, even if you miss the initial swipe, like the fire on the ground will eventually get them and does a lot of damage. And what I love about this weapon is it's not too far into the game. You will have to defeat a Deathrite bird in the lower parts of the Aeonia Swamp, but that's not so far. And if you just kind of beeline it there at the beginning of the game and maybe get a summons to help you, or if you have experience fighting this enemy, you can defeat it pretty quickly, and then you'll have this weapon that you can play, you know, 85 to 90% of the game with, which is great. And as far as armor goes, I'm using Malakath set on my chest, legs, and gloves, and the Sanguine Noble's hood for the sort of look that I have going on, the black and gold look, which I really like, kind of fits the Ghostblade theme in my opinion. However, this is not exactly optimized because the poise is below 51 or 56, so I have to use the Bullgoat's Talisman to get over that, you know, using up a Talisman slot, but I do prioritize fashion in some of these builds. But if you're talking about early on in the game, what can you use armor-wise? If you're just starting out and you want to use something because you won't be able to get this armor right away, I would suggest using the Knight set. This has 51 poise by default, giving you enough, and you don't need to use a Talisman in that slot. So for talismans, there are a lot of good ones for this build. For starters, Warrior Jar Shard or Shard of Alexander, whichever you have, is good for boosting the damage of Ghost Flame Ignition. It's just straight damage increase. It's really, really nice. Magic Scorpion Charm later on in the game is also good for boosting this significantly. So I would look out for those two if you want to increase your damage with Ghost Flame Ignition. I do like the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman for further protection, particularly if you are using the Magic Scorpion Charm. But the Curved Sword Talisman in general is also really good, and this is one you can get much earlier in the game. That's good for block counters. We have a shield here that we're using. I like the Scorpion Shield for the look, kind of matches the theme. It's not ideal, again. You know, ideally you'd probably have a Great Shield for this build. You have more than enough equip load that you could use one to get better block counters, but I sort of like the style here, which is why I went with this. And the Scorpion Shield fully upgraded has 64 guard counter, which is really nice, or guard boost. So that's really pretty strong for a medium shield in general. And you should aim to do block counters early on in the game if you're using this build on trash enemies, and pair it with something like the Assassin's Cerulean Dagger in order to gain FP back. Because I'm showing you footage that's in New Game Plus where I have tons of FP, I have tons of flasks, so So I can use Ghost Flame Ignition like at will, pretty much. But if you're talking about playing early on in the game, this is a very expensive weapon skill to use. So getting some back from block counters, or FP back from block counters, can allow you to use it more often. And, you know, also pairing it with something like the Carrion Filigree Crest, when you get it to reduce its cost from 25 down to 19, is also not a bad idea. So there are a lot of talismans you can play with as you progress the game. Probably early on in the game, you'll be focused with, you know, FP management. And then as you get further into the game and find some of the later game talismans, you'll be focusing more on damage. And something else I want to mention for this build is that I do have a staff in my offhand as well. I'm using the Staff of Loss, but you can use any staff. I don't even have it upgraded, and I have at least 20 intelligence. And the reason for that is that I want to be able to use Terra Magica periodically, because this boosts your magic damage by 35% while you're standing inside it. And if you go into a boss fight and drop this, and then drop your Ghost Flame Ignition on the ground in a fire trail, it's going to boost that damage significantly. And then when, you know, a boss or strong enemy walks into it, you're going to take even more damage, and you're just absolutely going to annihilate them with that damage. And it can absolutely devastate bosses. You'll see in my gameplay footage, if you haven't already, the bosses just go down so fast when buffed with this. And it's not something you can use all the time, and you know, particularly early on in the game, FP management is going to be difficult for you. But this is a spell you can get fairly early on in Luring of the Lakes. And eventually you'll want it for certain boss fights where you do have time to set up that combo. So then attribute-wise, at level 150 for this build, I have 50 Vigor, 31 Mind, 32 Endurance, 35 Strength, 45 Dexterity, 20 Intelligence, 7 Faith, and 9 Arcane. And the 20 Intelligence, as I mentioned earlier, will boost your Ghost Flame Ignition damage, but it's really there to meet the requirements for Terra Magica. We're really not too worried about Intelligence. Strength and Dexterity is there to boost the damage of your weapon itself, because again, its attack rating is not that high for a greatsword. It's very light, and it scales better with Dexterity than Strength, but if you're two-handing it, you might get a little bit more out of Strength, and also, if you plan to use a Great Shield, you'll want some Strength. So you could go higher Dexterity, lower Strength. You get very little damage out of doing it. We're talking a couple of points by going up to like 55 Dex and 25 Strength by flopping those around. So you know, this is a pretty good stat spread in my opinion. Endurance-wise, you simply need enough to meet your equip load and medium roll. I have over the amount that I need here, so you could go heavier armor, which is probably optimal in order to give you more protection and to be able to drop the Bullgoat's Talisman and replace it with one of the ones I mentioned. Mind, you're going to want a good bit. Try and keep in mind that this costs 25 FP. It's 15 for the initial part and then 10 for the follow-up. Plan to always do the follow-up if you use it. So you're going to want to try and keep it like an even number that divides well between 25. So something like 175, 200, something like that. You can see I have 179 here just because I couldn't get it exactly evenly. It was either below 175 or higher. If you take this up a bit, you could probably get this to 200, and that would allow you to use this 8 times before you flask. It's not so important later on in the game, but early on in the game, try and hit maybe like 100 FP so you can use this 4 times before needing to flask. And then Vigor is obviously 50 here is a good point. We have pretty good protection, and that helps to keep you alive. And as you're going through the game, obviously, your priority is to meet the minimum requirements for the weapon, which are not high. It's like 15 strength, 17 dexterity, and 11 intelligence. You can meet that fairly early on in the game. Then you want to upgrade that. And because, you know, strength and dexterity don't affect the weapon skill damage, just upgrading it's really going to give you most of your damage with your weapon skill. So you want to make sure you upgrade that baby right away, but you don't need to focus too much on strength and dexterity. You can focus more on vigor, mind, and endurance, be able to wear armor and medium roll, and to be able to use the weapon skill more often. And then when it comes to Flask of Wondrous Physique here, I have the Magic Shroud and Cracked here to further boost our magic damage when we're fighting with this. You can use this in boss fights or in stretches of the game to further boost your damage. It's not going to boost it tremendously because the weapon itself does not have a lot of magic damage, but it will boost your Ghost Flame Ignition a lot because it's pure magic damage. So even when you're out on the landscape and you're making your way through difficult enemies, it's beneficial to use it if you know you're not going to run into a boss before it runs out or something like that. And I also have Stamina Regeneration here. Just Stamina Regeneration in general is really good, but you could add Intelligence or Dexterity or Strength, something to give you more damage as well if you prefer. And then for Great Runes, I think either Godric's or Radon are the two that I would use here. You use 6 stats, so Godric's is going to be good early on to help meet some of the stat spread for this setup, which is great. And then Radon's just giving you health, stamina, and MP or FP is just good in general as well. So you could go either one of those, in my opinion. Godric's is probably going to hold, you're going to get Godric's earlier, so you'll probably be more likely to use it than you would Radon's, but you could consider swapping to Radon's once you gain it. And just a couple last tips before I wrap up. Sometimes you can use the L2 of this weapon and not follow up with R1 and R2 if you're in a pinch, like in a boss fight. You see them doing a big windup and you realize you're not going to be able to finish the animation. Sometimes just getting that original L2 off is fine, and it does a lot of damage itself. So keep in mind that you don't always have to follow up with an R1 or an R2. And sort of piggybacking off that, make sure you have a good amount of poise with this build, because you want to be able to finish that animation when possible. Like if you got to tank a boss hit in order to pull off that R1 or R2 follow-up, tank it. Like you're going to come out ahead on that trade most of the time. So make sure you have good poise when possible. And lastly, you can absolutely play this build with sorceries and increase your intelligence and just kind of like leave your strength and dexterity low and get even more Ghost Flame Ignition damage, since that's what you tend to kill most of the enemies with this weapon, or at least the hard to kill enemies and bosses, and then fling spells at regular enemies if you want. You could absolutely go that way. I just built this, for the weapon specifically, kind of more into like a traditional knight setup, but you could go more on the sorcery casting side if you want to focus on intelligence. So that wraps up the Ghostblade build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. This is one you can use from very early on in the game, for most of the game, and it's a ton of fun. It's absolutely devastating. You can see it just chewing through New Game Plus bosses like easy peasy. So imagine what it's like on New Game if you get this really early on and just upgrade it with some Somber Stone. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys have other builds you want to see, let me know in the comments below.